U.S. President Donald Trump says he will now impose a 50% tariff on copper imports. He made the declaration at a cabinet meeting in Washington.
We did steel, as you know, they're 50%. We did aluminum, 50%. Lumber just came out.
Why don't you announce copper?
And we did cars. And now today we're doing copper.
For the first time in decades, the United States has been hit with a copper shock that could shake the entire economy. Within 24 hours of Donald Trump announcing a 50% tariff on imported copper, America lost $4.2 billion, and copper prices on Wall Street exploded to record highs. But the real bombshell came when Canada, the U.S.'s biggest supplier, froze all exports overnight, leaving industries scrambling for survival. Canada didn't waste a single day after Trump's tariff order. Within hours, Ottawa froze all copper export contracts to the United States, effectively cutting off more than 40% of America's refined copper supply. Canadian miners like Teck Resources began exploring sales to Asia instead of the U.S. to circumvent the tariffs. Mining firms such as Hudbay immediately paused shipments to the U.S. market. The Canadian government issued a clear statement: we cannot depend on a partner that suddenly changes trade rules. A message widely reported in national press coverage. This was more than political anger, it was a calculated strategy. Canada rolled out a $1.8 billion export expansion plan aimed at directing copper trade toward Asia and Europe. Japan, South Korea, and China were named as new priority buyers. This move marked a pivotal shift. Canada was repositioning from a U.S.-dependent supplier into a global exporter. Analysts at the Financial Times called it a calculated shift, not a reaction. By freezing exports and repurposing trade routes, Canada reduced its exposure to U.S. tariff shocks, while giving Asian refiners a stronger role in global copper flows. For Canada, it meant wider markets and greater stability. For the U.S., it triggered immediate shortages and rising prices. Canada's counterstrike turned Trump's tariff into an opportunity to redraw the global copper map. The copper market flipped overnight after Trump's 50% tariff announcement. Prices in the United States jumped 13% on COMEX, reaching nearly $5.69 per pound. But while American prices surged, LME prices slipped slightly, creating a historic gap. U.S. copper became almost 25% more expensive than international copper, prompting arbitrage trades between markets. Traders quickly seized on this, buying cheaper copper overseas and selling it in the U.S. at higher prices, an arbitrage boom. Experts said this exposed a deep flaw in Trump's tariff logic. Instead of stabilizing supply, it fueled speculation and disruption. Hedge funds poured billions into copper futures outside the U.S., hoping to benefit from the turmoil. Analysts warned that America risked economic isolation in global copper markets, as its price premium made imports unattractive. Economists likened the situation to the 1930s Hoover tariffs, when protectionism collapsed international trade. For U.S. industries, this meant paying premium prices while competitors in Asia and Europe accessed cheaper copper. Canadian copper exports previously headed to the U.S. were now being redirected to Asia, weakening America's grip on global supply. Analysts at Brookings called it a dangerous move toward economic isolation. The shock rippled into electronics, auto manufacturing, and construction, where copper is essential. What began as a tariff tactic became a global market distortion, turning U.S. copper into the world's most expensive and destabilizing metal. The copper tariff exposed a truth many in Washington already knew: America is not self-sufficient in copper. In 2024, the United States imported almost 300,000 metric tons of refined copper, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. That covered roughly 45% of national copper demand. Most imports came from Canada, Chile, Peru, and Mexico. At the same time, domestic refining capacity fell sharply. Plants like ASARCO's Hayden smelter in Arizona have been mothballed, and the U.S. now covers less than 10% of its refining needs through domestic facilities. Experts at the Competitive Enterprise Institute warned bluntly, this tariff is a tax on U.S. consumers, not a path to security. In practice, tariffs don't fix the real supply gap. They just raise prices for American manufacturers and households. The U.S. hoped tariffs would shift demand to domestic copper, but there simply isn't enough production to support that shift. Worse still, other suppliers like Peru and Chile might follow Canada's lead in seeking Asian buyers, further cutting U.S. access. Economists say that without major new investment in refining and mining, the U.S. will remain vulnerable and dependent on foreign copper. In the end, what was sold as a strategy for national security laid bare just how fragile America's copper system really is. The copper tariff did not just hit governments and markets, it struck everyday industries across America. Electric vehicles are one of the hardest hit. Each EV uses about 80 kilograms of copper for batteries, wiring, and motors. With copper prices jumping, the cost of building each car has risen by thousands of dollars. Companies like Tesla and Ford are already delaying projects and losing millions every month. Utility companies are also struggling. They rely on copper for transformers and power lines. Now they are filing for emergency rate hikes of 22 to 25%, pushing electricity bills higher for millions of homes. Construction has also been crushed. The National Association of Home Builders warns that the cost of building a single-family house could rise by $17,000 to $22,000 just from copper price increases. Small manufacturers of electronics and wiring in states like Ohio and Indiana are losing contracts to suppliers in Asia, where copper is cheaper and more stable. UBS projects that U.S. GDP could shrink by 0.5% in fourth quarter because of these disruptions. For families, this crisis showed up in higher bills, more expensive cars, and rising housing costs. For businesses, it means shrinking profits, stalled projects, and possible layoffs. The tariff was meant to protect industry, but instead it has created shortages and higher costs. From automakers to electricians, the copper shock is spreading pain through nearly every sector of the U.S. economy. Canada is no longer acting like a quiet supplier to the United States. After freezing copper exports to the U.S., Ottawa began redirecting trade to Asia. In 2023, Canada exported nearly $9.3 billion worth of copper and copper-based products, with over half going to the U.S. Now much of that flow is shifting to markets like Japan, South Korea, and China. To support this, the Canadian government rolled out a $1.8 billion plan to build new export routes, upgrading ports, rails, and refining capacity. Canadian mining firms such as Teck Resources and Hudbay Minerals are already restructuring contracts toward Asian refiners. For decades, Canada's copper trade depended heavily on U.S. demand. Now that dependency is ending. Analysts say Canada is shifting from being a regional supplier to a global copper competitor. For the U.S., this means American industries lose guaranteed access to a key supplier. For Canada, it's a chance to reduce risk and build stronger global alliances. By aligning with Asia, Canada is stepping into a leadership role in the global copper value chain. This pivot marks a new identity, a true global supplier and strategic rival. The copper tariff is not just about one metal. It's becoming a warning for the entire U.S. economy. Copper is inside every car, every power line, every phone, and every home. When copper prices rise, the cost of daily life rises too. Trump's 50% tariff has already pushed the U.S. into a $4.2 billion loss, but the true damage is just beginning. Analysts say the same ripple effects could spread into food, lumber, and many other sectors, not only hardware. Canada's copper freeze shows partners can and will walk away when trade rules change suddenly. This is today's global trade reality. No one stays dependent on a single market. countries now build multiple alliances, sending trade to Asia, Europe, and beyond. That means the U.S. is losing its long-held status as the center of global supply chains. Economists warn its weak refining base makes it especially vulnerable. Unlike China, which has invested heavily in copper smelters, the U.S. lets its plants close. That gap can't be fixed quickly. When tariffs raise costs, American factories and families end up paying. Economists compare this to the 1930s Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which deepened the Great Depression by collapsing international trade. But today's world is even more connected. Protectionism in one sector spreads into energy, housing, and technology. Canada's pivot to Asia proves global trade continues, with or without the United States. The bigger picture is now clear. This isn't just a fight over copper, it's a warning that protectionist policies can backfire, isolating America, weakening its industries, and making consumers pay more. America's copper tariff has backfired, driving losses, shortages, and rising costs for every household. Subscribe now and stay with us as we uncover how this trade war could reshape the global economy.